I'm Still Here by Infinite Songbird on AO3. Chapter 5, The Ally. Keith forgot how to breathe. He sat, paralyzed from head to toe as a wave of nausea ran through his body. Blood rushed through his ears and filled his brain with static until he felt numb. His cheeks tingled with the terror of being discovered, of being vulnerable. Vulnerable to the woman reclining into the chair across from him, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction as if she'd won whatever game they'd been playing. Vulnerable to the curious yet sharp gaze of her first mate, who watched Keith with a too casual air from his position at the captain's side. Vulnerable, most of all, to the whim of the precious orb in his pocket, the map that seemed determined to be found even when they'd taken every measure to keep its existence secret. Breathe. All at once, air rushed back into his lungs, filling him until he was lightheaded and dizzy. Sound filtered back into consciousness, the static in his ears dying enough that the muffled noise of the ship beyond the cabin door came back into focus. The whole world came rushing back in, and with it, the realization that Keith wasn't going to let himself go down without a fight. He leaned back in his chair, keeping his face carefully blank as he raised an indifferent eyebrow. "I don't know what you're talking about." The captain's smug assuredness twisted into a scowl, and Keith inwardly celebrated the tiny win in his inevitable trail to loss. "Don't play stupid with me," she snapped, leaning forward to smack her palms against the desk. "You really think you can sneak an item radiating that much quintessence past an Altean?" "Two Alteans," Cram piped up indignantly, but Keith was too busy reeling from the new information to pay him any mind. He supposed it made sense, considering Zarkon's obsession with the element. Still, it didn't quell his awe at the knowledge that the item he'd been carrying in his pocket was made from quintessence, likely the work of a skilled alchemist. It was no wonder that he and Shiro had been made the second they'd set foot on the Melanor. Alteans were practically walking, talking quintessence detectors, the original race to discover and harness the element's properties. They'd been the first to study the way raw quintessence, the purest form of energy, flowed through each living being, solidifying into solid and liquid forms when concentrated in high qualities. Out of all living things, it was Alteans who contained the highest amounts of the raw element. It settled on their cheeks, giving them the glowing marks they sported. It buzzed through their veins, gifting them with abilities that, to Keith, seemed almost akin to magic. It was for that reason that Captain Zarkon, in his mad quest to harness the unlimited energy of quintessence for his own destructive gains, had begun his conquest with the planet of Altea. Tearing himself away from his thoughts of the map's mysterious origin, Keith shrugged, picking disinterestedly at a fingernail. "Like I said, no clue what you're talking about." The captain's eyes blazed. "Then I suppose you wouldn't mind turning out your pockets, Mr. Kagane?" Next to him, Shiro went rigid, and Keith struggled to hold on to his own cool veneer. "All due respect, Captain." He leaned forward, resting his hands in front of hers on the desk. She wrinkled her nose at the almost contact, her fingers retracting away from his and curling into tight fist. "You're our hired crew. The ship may be yours, but you've got no business with my personal effects." In the deafening silence that followed, tension settled over the four like heavy fog, thick and suffocating and indestructible. And then the captain was laughing hollowly, her chair scraping across the wooden floor she stood. "You've got fire in your blood, Mr. Kagane. I'll give you that." Her mouth curving into a fierce snarl, her eyes blazing. "But mine burns brighter." Besides her, Karan moved to place a hand on her shoulder, his eyes wary. "Princess?" "Princess?" "No!" She shrugged off her lieutenant's touch, and before Keith had even processed her speed, her rifle was unholstered. "I'll ask one more time," she snarled. Keith's pulse raced as he stared cross-eyed at the barrel between his eyes. "Give me the bloody map." "Okay!" The shout filled the cabin, wild and panicked, but it wasn't Keith who had spoken. Shiro's chair screeched against the floor as he stood so abruptly that he almost sent it flying. "We'll give it to you, just please don't hurt him." Keith, who was still staring down the barrel of a gun, practically growled, "Shiro, no!" The pistol swung away, and Keith's heart leaped into his throat as he watched Shiro stare wide-eyed at the weapon now trained on himself. The safety clicked, and Keith wasted no time in standing, procuring the map from his pocket without another thought. "It's here, okay?" His chest heaved, and he struggled to think through the pounding in his head. "Just here, fucking take it." He didn't need to ask twice. In the blink of an eye, the pistol was holstered, and the captain had snatched the map from his hand, blinking down at it owlishly. Karan was at her side in a couple of long strides, peering down at the artifact with undistinguished awe. Keith, meanwhile, was already reaching for Shiro, his mind racing with thoughts of his cousin's safety as they gripped one another's forearms. You okay? Am I okay? Shiro's grip turned tight, his eyes filling with anger. Keith, what the fuck were you thinking? We're not here so you can gamble with your life. Why are you here? Came the captain's sharp voice, and the two of them turned to find her and her first mate closely watching the display. She rolled the map between her hands as she stepped towards them, slow and measured. The Galaxy Garrison's head of outreach, she mused, her piercing gaze flicking to Shiro, and a humble innkeeper's son. She threw Keith a disdainful look, and it was only Shiro's calm hand on his shoulder that kept him from flying forward in rage. Clearly having caught Keith's twitch of aborted movement, she raised an eyebrow and reached over her desk to flick a switch on its holoprojector. Oh yes, Mr. Kigone, I have done my research. Flicking to life in front of their eyes were his and Shiro's garrison records, document upon document of data sprawling out beside the awful black and white picture they'd been forced to take. Over Keith's picture, the words disciplinary discharge were sprawled across his face in bright red. How do you have those? Shiro asked carefully, giving Keith's shoulder a comforting squeeze as if he could sense the pure outrage boiling underneath. Possession of classified records is against the law, Captain, he finished, voice hard. She cocked her head. Whose law, Commander? Commander Shirogane? Montresa's? The Meridian Systems? Her eyes narrowed into slits. I do not belong to your law, and therefore I am not bound by it. Shiro swallowed, and the captain sat at the edge of her desk, daintily crossing her legs. I'll admit I had my suspicions when I answered your husband's posting. A trip to the cannon for charting purposes. The rumored locations of Zarkon's trove. She shook her head, a small and condescending smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. No one travels to the cannon. It's a death trap. You must know how foolishly transparent that sounded. Okay, whatever. Irritated and impatient, Keith stepped forward, ignoring Shiro's hiss of warning. You saw the posting, looked us up, figured we must have the map. Congratulations. Are you going to kill us now? Keith! This time, his cousin sounded truly pissed, stepping forward to shove Keith back into a chair. He fell heavily, wincing as his tailbone collided with the wood. Whirling back on the captain, Shiro splayed his hands out at his sides. Look, we're not going to get anywhere like this, he growled, sounding himself strained for patience. Corinne nodded empathetically in agreement. Couldn't agree more, my boy. Why, I remember the time I was caught in an argument between a salvor and a I want to know why you are here, the captain insisted, ignoring her lieutenant, who seemed rather unbothered by the interruption. And, she continued, pointedly raising the map, I want to know how you came to possess this. She shook it out in front of her, and Keith dug his nails into the chair's plush armrest. And if you lie to me again, I'll throw you both off my ship before you can so much as beg for forgiveness. Fine, Keith snapped, his voice low, but then you tell us your deal. After a brief hesitation, the captain nodded. Very well. Not quite knowing where to start, and too angry to cohere his thoughts into a full sentence, Keith was more than a little relieved when Shiro sighed and took over. A couple weeks ago, a member of the Blade of Remora crash-landed outside our inn. The captain's eyes widened, and Shiro continued. He was on the run. We have no idea who he was running from, but they were definitely pirates. They burnt our inn. I saw that in the files. Allura broke in softly. She swallowed, wringing her hands, and Keith was shocked by how instantly approachable the gesture made her seem. I'm sorry. She sounded like she meant it, too. Keith averted his eyes, but not before catching Shiro's appreciative nod and weak smile. The Blade agent entrusted the map to Keith, so wait, I beg your pardon? This time, when Keith turned to look at her, she looked less sheepish about the interruption. Her eyebrows pinched as she regarded Keith like he were something particularly nasty she'd trod on. He's merely a boy. Look. Keith stood so hard that his chair fell over, clattering to the floor behind him. His cousin scrambled to right it, but Keith's entire focus was on the Altean in front of him. You've seen my files, he bid, ignoring the flashing red across his own holographic face. So you've clearly already got your own opinions about me. And that's... He paused to heave a breath, trying to tame the wildfire raging in his chest. Don't fucking cry. I get it, okay? He swallowed, his next words coming out far weaker than he'd intended. I'm used to it. But that map's already destroyed my home, and it'll be responsible for destroying others unless we make sure no one else ever finds it. The captain gave him a long look, and Keith shivered, the weight of her gaze reminding him of the way Thace had looked at him before gifting Keith his trust. Then she sighed, her face falling and shoulders slumping as she turned her gaze down to the map in her hands. I lost my home, too. Entirely too stunned by her sudden change in demeanor to speak, Keith merely stood in silence, gaping at the captain as she rolled the orb between her palms. Her features, once serene and proud as a marble statue, had crumbled into unspeakable grief and despondence. As if sensing Keith's surprise, she briefly met his eyes, giving him a small smile before returning her focus to the artifact in her hands. I'm sure you both heard the tale of the Flora Galaxy. Shiro stepped forward, gingerly lowering himself into a chair as if he too was afraid to break the atmosphere. We don't travel much outside the Meridian system, ma'am, but we've heard. Keith nodded in agreement, and the captain pursed her lips, her gaze still lowered. Zalcon leached it dry, she hoarsely explained. You may know, but you cannot truly know the extent of the destruction until you've seen that. Her voice wobbled. Filthy. Pirate and his cronies tore every planet in the galaxy apart for quintessence to use as damn rocket fuel. She looked up, her eyes glistening with anger as they locked onto Keith's. Why do you think there are so many Alteans in the Meridian system? On Montressa? He mined the very life force of our planet, of my people, until it was uninhabitable. Her hands visibly trembled with anger, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. A haunting silence engulfed the room, and, after a moment's debate, Keith asked the question that'd been on his mind for several minutes. Karen mentioned you were a princess? The question came out even softer than he'd intended. Over the captain's shoulder, Karen shot him a kind smile. Yes, she rasped, wiping at her cheek with the back of her hand. Keith's chest ached with sympathy. One of many, but a princess nonetheless. My mother and father were. Karen squeezed her shoulder. They fell, battling the witch Minerva. Sarkon's right hand. Keith mumbled, eyes wide. The captain nodded. You've heard of her, then. What you may not have heard is that I delivered to her the very same fate that she delivered to my parents. Oh. Keith breathed, falling shell-shock into the chair beside Shiro, who inhaled sharply. You killed the witch? Another nod, and this time Keith could see it in her eyes, the dead cold conviction of a woman who'd seen revenge. I attacked her on her own ship after Zalcon fled the Flora Galaxy. She refused to tell me where he'd gone, and She looked out at one of the cabin's circular windows, and Keith suppressed a chill. We had intel concerning the map's location from one of the Blademer Moore's undercover operatives. Trusting the Golra was a difficult task until that point we'd only ever known Golra to be pirates, but the Blades proved themselves to be different. They were tried and true, and grew to be valuable friends and allies. We sacrificed many good soldiers, Golra and otherwise, in our attempts to find this. She held the map up to the light, huffing a numb, humorless laugh as she stared at it. And now it has fallen directly into my hands. Faye has an awful sense of humor. Wouldn't you say so, Karen? Her lieutenant leaned over, pressing a fatherly kiss to her hair. Does indeed, princess. For a few seconds, the room's silence hung heavy in the air between them. And then the captain was regarding Keith with a tear-stoked face, holding the map out before her. Take it, Mr. Kugane. Put it in the safe behind you, and I trust you'll not breathe a word to this about anyone on this ship. Keith blinked at her. You're not going to ask me how to open it? She chuckled and shook her head, wiping once more at her face with her free hand. A show of good faith, Mr. Kugane. It's Keith, he blurted, feeling immediately stupid for doing so. I mean, you can still call me. I'm just trying to say. Keith. The captain stood, stepping toward him with a warm smile. Gentle fingers wrapped around his wrist, depositing the map in his hands with the utmost care and placing her fingers over his own. Thank you for being someone I can trust. It has been too long since I've allowed myself that luxury. Twice now he'd been granted the unmerited trust of a virtual stranger. He swallowed. I'm not sure what I've done to deserve that, but thank you, ma'am. Allura. His responding expression must have been disarmingly ridiculous because she giggled. Beyond this cabin, you are still to address me using the proper titles, but she gave his hand a squeeze. I believe sharing the secrets of the universe puts us on first-name basis, don't you? Keith was unable to do much more than grin slowly in response, and the captain, Allura, patted his hand. Go on, Keith. His gaze flicked from hers, hopeful and trusting, to Karan's, warm and assured, to his cousin's, fond and proud. He nodded, turning to the safe she'd indicated and pulling it open pulling open its ornately carved wooden doors. It was empty within, save for a small chest, sitting with its lid invitingly open. After a second's thought, Keith carefully placed the map inside and snapped the lid shut. Excellent. Alora strode forward, reaching beyond the high neckline of her blouse to procure a key from a cabin around her neck. She shut the safe with a firm thud, locking it with a practiced movement before whirling back on Keith and Cheryl. You are more than welcome to check on the map at any time, should you need the reassurance. I promise I shall guard it with my life. Cheryl stood, his chair creaking. We believe you, Princess. He threw Keith a grimace, running a hand over his face. This is the safest place for it. We didn't have much of a plan as far as storage goes, so thank you. Ah! Corinne held up a finger, scrambling from his place behind the desk to join the group at the safe. Speaking of which, whatever was your plan once you reached the cannon? Cheryl sighed and winced, sheepishly rubbing the back of his neck with his cybernetic hand. Activate the map and steal a longboat in the dead of night? To Keith's surprise and delight, both Alora and Corinne sniggered. Cheryl's face reddened, his mouth lifting into an involuntarily embarrassed half-smile. I didn't say it was the best plan. Alora waved a hand, her mouth pressed into a thin line as she suppressed another giggle. No matter. The four of us shall procure a more suitable solution by the time we arrive. She turned to Corinne with a snap of her fingers. Perhaps we might leave the ship under the guise of a scouting mission. This is meant to be a charting course, after all. We. The word should have made Keith feel terrified. And he and Cheryl had spent so long preparing to take the risk alone, and now their operation had expanded. He should have felt guilty, violated. Instead, he felt nothing but relief, as if two more people had stepped up to shoulder the enormous weight that lay atop his and Cheryl's shoulders. It made him feel safer, less alone. The question remains, Alora continued, pressing the tips of her fingers together before her lips. What to do when we arrived? Throw it in and get the hell out. Keith cut in, and Corinne chuckled. Brilliant! Can't find the trove if you can't find the map, he reasoned, and Keith grinned at him. Exactly. Alora sighed, maneuvering around her desk to drop heavily into her chair, and the image was so far from her poised and regal captain persona that Keith almost laughed. She was several years older than him, from what he could recall of the little information they discovered on her record, 31, if he remembered correctly, just a year younger than Adam. But at that moment, Keith could imagine the two of them becoming great friends. This is much to process, she sighed, rubbing tiredly at her temples. Let us retire this discussion for the time being, gentlemen. I prefer that your absence go relatively unnoticed by this particular crew. A chill crawled up Keith's spine, and he watched his cousin's brows furrow before Cheryl was asking, You don't trust them? Frankly, I don't trust anyone anymore, Commander, at least of all the crew that would volunteer themselves for this particular journey without discernible reason. But you trust us, Cheryl asserted. Their captain nodded, reclining in her chair. The two of you willingly put your lives in mortal danger to guarantee that this map remains a secret. She turned to Keith, her voice taking on a soft edge. You were willing to die for it. Unable to deny the words, Keith bit the inside of his cheek, ignoring Cheryl's eyes burning into the side of his face. The two of you I trust, Alora confirmed, gesturing to their holographic pictures. Imperfect records. She swept a hand over Keith's scowling visage, and the image disappeared. A rogue commander, she dismissed Cheryl's files and fixed him with a pensive look. At least I assume you are working outside of Montresa's Galaxy Garrison. I found no record of a garrison-sanctioned mission to the cannon. Keith bit his lip, and Cheryl nodded solemnly. That's correct. We felt it best not to involve the garrison. He needn't have continued. Alora nodded empathetically, as if Cheryl had just proved her point. Precisely. You've both treated this knowledge with the utmost discretion and delicacy. You understand the repercussions of discovery by those who might wish to use the contents of the trove for personal gain or power. She flicked a hand, and up shot multiple holographic files. This crew that Mr. Wright hired, on the other hand, their records are clean. Far too clean. I cannot vet them as I did you, precisely because I fear that doing so will reveal our very purpose. But I shall be exercising the utmost caution around them. You're both to report to me if you see or hear any cause for suspicion. Actually, Keith traded a look with Cheryl. There's something else you should know. One of Alora's perfectly manicured brows lifted, and Keith took that as a sign to continue. Before his face, the Blade operative we met, before he died, he said I should watch out for some cyborg. Alora inhaled sharply, and Karan folded his arms across his chest. Blast, he grumbled. If he were referring to Sendek, we should hope not. Alora tightly responded. When Keith and Shiro exchanged another look, she sighed. After Zarkon fled, she explained, many of his most ruthless followers attempted to continue his work from the shadows. Zendek was one of his most devoted commanders, a Golver cyborg famed for his ruthlessness. Kren and I have tried to track him for years in connection to the destruction of Altea, but... She sighed wearily, and Keith was reminded again of how very young she was. We've never even seen him. Not even the Blade is sure what he looks like. If Zarkon was a master of disappearance, Zendek is smoke, impossible to pin. The map falling into his hands would be a cataclysmic catastrophe. Another silence fell over them, this one weighted with tense apprehension, broken only when Karan groaned and massaged his temples. We must too keep a close eye on those of our crew who are cybernetically enhanced. His eyes met Shiro's, and his face turned a ruddy shade of red. Present company excluded, of course. Silver, Keith blurted, heart suddenly racing. And McLean, Alora added, and Keith felt himself suck in a breath. Taking note of his reaction, she leveled him with a weighty stare. I shall expect you to keep a close eye on both of them, Keith. You may very well be our best source of intel. Keith nodded, although when he responded, his thoughts weren't of mismatched eyes and dimpled laughter. Instead, they instantly worried over a glowing red eye and the stench of foul breath. I'll let you know the second I hear something. She nodded, her lips flattened into a thin line. Very good. Now, she stood once more, hands splayed over her desk, and Keith marveled at the way the pose resembled the one she struck when they'd first entered her cabin. We were different people then, he thought, looking around the room. Before him now stood a team, all determinedly reliant on one another to save the universe. The thought sent a thrill of purpose through him, and he raised his chin a little higher as the captain addressed them. I advise that we all put ourselves together and return to the company of our crew before we are missed. The rest of their first day went relatively smoothly by comparison. No more pistols were pulled, no more tempers raised, and Keith hardly even saw hide or hair of Silver or Lance for the rest of the day. Lance in particular seemed determined to avoid Keith like the plague, practically teleporting to the opposite end of the ship whenever he noticed Keith's presence. Silver, on the other hand, had immediately assigned Keith to help Karan with the evening's meal prep, and as he departed into the galley, Keith had been sure to throw Lance, who was lounging near the bow with Cosmo, the dirtiest look he could muster. Time passed quickly in the galley, despite, or as a result of, Keith wasn't sure, Karan's endless rambling. The Altean seemed to have no shortage of stories regarding his childhood, and by the time dinner was ready to be served, Keith was well familiar with the legend that was Karan, the Gorgeous Man, as he claimed to have been called in his youth. Keith really hated how catchy the title was. Dinner was a pureed goo made of peas and some kind of gelatinous root that Keith had never heard of. When he pulled a face upon seeing the finished product, Karan wagged a stern finger. Now, it's better than it looks, my boy. My grandpappy's own recipe, the healthiest concoction for the intrepid spacefarer, he recited, sticking his nose into the air. In lieu of a response, Keith had simply stared down at the green, wobbly mass in the pot and silently dubbed it food goo. Lance materialized just in time to help Karan and Keith carry 3 full trays of goo up and out of the galley and down into the neighboring mess hall. Keith had been hoping that the cyborg's pissy mood might have dissipated, and that the two of them might be able to call a ceasefire. If anything, Lance seemed even more irate, responding to Keith's whispered, "And where the hell have you been?" with a snippy, "Wouldn't you like to know?" They'd sat as far as possible from one another during dinner. Lance had a rowdy table with Silver and a few other crew members, and Keith had a solemn table with Shiro, Karan, and the captain. A heavy silence had sat between them, electrified with secret and buzzing with knowledge of their newfound alliance. When Alora had finished, dabbing at the corner of her mouth with a napkin, as she stood to leave, she'd caught Keith's eye and winked, the action so minute and intimate that Keith's mouth curled up into the barest hint of a smile. He just managed to choke down the last of Karan's wretched concoction. Stars above, how his heart ached for his father's cooking. And was about to follow Shiro out of the mess hall when a large hand landed on his shoulder, the touch uncomfortably heavy. "And where do you think you're going, boy?" a bone-chilling voice asked, and Keith turned to find Silver leering down at him. Behind the giant of a man stood Lance, leveling Keith with that infuriatingly smug smirk as he leaned a hip against the table, arms folded over his chest. Fearing that he might lose control and break the other boy's nose, Keith took special care not to look at or talk to him for the remainder of the evening. Not when everyone had finally filed out of the mess hall, leaving the two of them alone. Not when they carried trays full of dirty plates back to the galley. Not when their shoulders brushed as they stood in tense silence before the sink, Lance washing while Keith dried. Not when Lance handed off a plate and their fingers touched, Keith swiftly yanking his hand away and ignoring the prickling at the back of his neck as Lance's eyes burned into the side of his head. For hours, neither of them spoke as they were each determined to win their silent standoff. And when they finally parted ways, Keith leaving the galley in search of Shiro, he did so without a word. Above deck, he found his cousin, looking pensive and forlorn as he sat on the bow, knees pulled up to his chest as he gazed out at the stars. Keith joined him in silence, his creaking footsteps the only announcement of his arrival, before he was hoisting himself up onto the banister beside him. They talked well into the night in hushed voices, the sides of their head gently pressed together as they relished one another's company. Something about the expensive gander before them made Keith feel, at that moment, as if the two of them were kids again, as if Keith had never screwed up and let their relationship dissolve over years of willful self-estrangement. As Cheryl lamented the way he'd left things with Adam, tense and upset, and Keith turned to press a discreet kiss to his cousin's shoulder, afraid that at any possible moment he might register that it was Keith he was talking to and take off. Instead, Cheryl merely wrapped an arm around his shoulders and pulled him closer. Their precious moment went unshattered. They sat long after the lanterns had been lit and the final crew member had retired for the night, left in relative privacy, with only Coran at the helm several yards away and Thorn up in the lookout. Their whispered conversation finally turned to discussion of the day's events. By the time Keith trudged down alone to the galley, nearly asleep on his feet, he was feeling more rejuvenated and settled than he had in weeks. The feeling remained uninterrupted when he reached the bottom of the stairs and found Lance already asleep, curled on his side atop his bedspread and pressed against the cupboards of the kitchen sink. Keith sighed, grateful that he could not see the other boy's face, and unrolled his own bedroll. He flopped down onto it with a grunt, falling asleep almost the second his eyes slid shut. At first, he wasn't sure what had roused him from his sleep. For several long minutes, he lay there, blinking himself into consciousness and wondering why he'd woken at such an ungodly hour. His entire body protested, begging him to submit to the pull of sleep, and he was about to surrender to its call when he heard it again. The sound that had pulled him from restless dreams filled with glittering purple quintessence and bright red eyes. From a couple feet away, Lance heaved another quiet, muffled sob that tapered off into a whimper, and Keith's gut clenched with guilt as he stared, motionless and stupefied and utterly useless, at the dark ceiling. Listening to Lance's futile attempts to contain his tears, he thought, hell of a way to end a first day. Keith rolled out of bed, groaning with exhaustion as his body ached with pain. It protested every movement, forcing him to lay on his side for several minutes before he finally had the ability to straighten. With a yawn, he stretched his arms over his head, wincing as pain bloomed in his lower back and shoulders. As he'd done every morning for the past 2 weeks, he cursed Thorn and her entire existence. Although only 16 days had passed since his turbulent first day, 16 days since the launch and his understanding with the captain, and his initial misunderstanding with Lance, Keith felt like he'd been in space for months. He was certainly just as sore as someone who had been. Swearing under his breath, he grunted as he reached for his boots, his fingers flailing as he attempted to reach them without bending his back. After far too much effort, he finally managed to snag one, pulling it towards him as he grumbled to himself. Fuck Thorn. Fuck her, and frankly, fuck training. He'd been so excited to start that first day. If he was being honest with himself, he was still excited. Combat training had been a favorite course of his during his short stint at the garrison, and learning to fight from someone who wasn't Iverson was like a dream come true. Thorn was, without a doubt, totally awesome, and Keith was lucky as hell to be under her tutelage. The hours spent in her company certainly provided a refreshing break from those spent in the stormy electricity of Lance's, or worse yet, in the hair-rising discomfort of Silver's. But she insisted on kicking his ass every morning at piss o'clock, as Lance had put it when they'd first met all those days ago, and Keith insisted on being as grumpy about his bruised body as possible. He and Shiro trained separately, Shiro's sessions being a good deal later in the day and a good deal shorter than his own, Thorn seemed to relish Keith's inexperience, visibly enjoying the way he would yelp when she attacked with all 6 arms, 6 deadly weapons swinging at him at once. The first time she'd tried this quaint little trick, Keith had been knocked on his ass within seconds. When he complained that 6 against 1 seemed phenomenally unfair, she argued that space is not fair, Mr. Kugane. The next time they'd sparred, she'd punished his complaining by using her tail as a 7th attacker, and Keith had nearly gone careening off the side of the ship when it caught him off guard. Though that had happened a couple days ago, Keith was still fuming about it. His back in agony after taking multiple hits from her tail. "Expect the unexpected, Mr. Kugane," Keith muttered in a poor imitation of her gruff voice. He yanked his boot on, the action far angrier than it had any right to be. "Space is wild, Mr. Kugane." Deciding his other boot was too far away for the time being, Keith changed tactics, grabbing the knife and belt that lay beside him, fastening the holster around his waist and stowing his weapon. The knife itself wasn't much, a simple blade the length of his forearm, the hilt wrapped with a worn leather grip. But Thorn had been correct when she'd guessed it would suit Keith. It was one of the most well-balanced weapons he'd ever held, well-suited proportionally and invigoratingly smooth to fight with. He pulled his shirt down over his belt, rolling his shoulders as he worked up the will to reach for his second shoe. "All right, fuck," he mumbled, leaning forward. He released a relieved breath when his range of movement seemed to increase, and he stretched himself closer, his fingers grazing the lip of the boot. With a tiny popping noise that had become all too familiar in the past couple weeks, Cosmo materialized before him, startling Keith into hastily retracting his outreached hand. For a second, the two of them stared at one another, and then they were both lunging for the shoe, Keith's back protesting with pain. Cosmo snatched the boot into his mouth, retreating from Keith a couple steps as his hand closed around nothing. Electric blue eyes pierced his own, intelligent and playful. Keith scowled, fully aware of what was about to occur and all too familiar with the game afoot. They had, after all, been playing it for half a month now. He cursed his past self for encouraging the behavior. It had been cute, at first, but it hadn't taken Keith long to grow weary of it. "Cosmo, I'm not in the mood. Drop it." The wolf's tail was practically a blur behind him as he took yet another step back. "I know you can understand me. It's way too early for this. Drop it, Cosmo had the sheer audacity to look confused, cocking his head with a tiny whine, and Keith lunged forward in a rush, knowing exactly what would happen next. "Don't you fucking dare!" In a blip, Cosmo disappeared, and Keith cursed as he scrambled off the floor, his thigh muscles screaming in agony. Barreling up the stairs and onto the deck, Keith blinked rapidly in an attempt to clear the sleep from his eyes, squinting around the deck until he found Cosmo sitting innocently several feet to his right, boot in mouth. Keith took a slow step toward him. "We can do this the easy way," he offered, trying to no avail to keep his voice light. "Or we could do this the hard way." Apparently, Cosmo thought the hard way sounded pretty damn good. He blinked out of existence, appearing again a couple feet to the left, and Keith lunged. His hands closed around thin air, and he swore loudly, garnering the attention of several members of the crew. They watched him with huffs of amusement, elbowing their fellow crew members in the ribs as if Keith were some entertaining spectacle. He felt his face flush under their mocking smiles, and he growled in frustration, just as Cosmo appeared in front of him once more. "This isn't funny, Cos. I had a rough night, okay? I'm serious. Just... Cosmo!" barked a voice behind him, and Keith instantly bristled. Lance came to stand at his side, arms folded across his chest. "Drop it. Now." Well, that was new. This had become something of a regular occurrence. Most mornings found Keith chasing down a shoe or fingerless glove in the most frustrating, impossible game of tag in existence. More often than not, the extravaganza would be accompanied by Lance's howls of laughter as he watched from a distance, usually perched in the rafters with his breakfast and never moving a muscle to help. In the end, Keith's saving grace was always Shiro, who Cosmo apparently thought it funny to instantly obey. The result tended to be a good 10 to 15 minutes of humiliation for Keith, only to come to an end when Shiro eventually showed up. Today was different. Keith had learned relatively early on that Cosmo was also irritatingly responsive to Lance, who seemed to just have a way with him. The only issue was, while Shiro used his gifts for good, Lance used his for complete and utter evil. He'd taken to encouraging the wolf's behavior, developing a nasty glint in his eye whenever Keith was in the vicinity and whispering, "Go get him, baby boy. Give him lots of big slobbery kisses." Without fail, Keith would end up on the floor as he received an impromptu bath, glaring up at Lance's stupid, grinning face and flipping him the bird. Never before had Lance actually helped, and Keith blinked tiredly at him, wondering if this was all some sleep-deprived illusion. To his embarrassment, Lance caught him staring, raising a questioning eyebrow at the very same time Keith's shoe dropped to the floor with a dull thud. What? Still watching Lance, though through narrowed eyes and suspicion, Keith cautiously stepped towards his shoe, noting the dusting of pink over Lance's cheeks. Nothing was apparently all his brain could manage. He hopped on one foot as he pulled his boot onto the other, trying to figure out why the hell Lance was still staring at him. I'm late for training, so... Right. Yeah. As Keith awkwardly turned to leave, eager to escape Lance's weirdness, the other boy caught his wrist in a gentle grip. He released it when Keith blinked up at him in surprise. I just wanted, about last night? No. Oh, fuck no. Was that what this is about? Mortification ushered blood into Keith's cheeks, and he chastised his own stupidity. 2 weeks to get used to waking up in the middle of the night because of Lance, yet what in all hells had possessed him to do that last night? Keith pulled his wrist away, ignoring the hurt in the other boy's eye. Oh, we don't need to. I didn't think you were awake. Lance swallowed, looking far more contrite than Keith had ever seen him. Yeah, well, I was, so... I'm really late, Keith blurted, not at all wanting to have this conversation. The expression on Lance's face, the lightness of his touch, the shyness that crept into his voice. Keith was far too tired to venture into such unfamiliar territory. I'll see you tonight, though, he called, already stepping away and trying to ignore the way his heart clenched when Lance's face fell. Yeah, see you. An hour later, he emerged from training with a nasty bruise under his eye and another lecture to focus to add to his ever-growing repertoire. He'd stood there and taken it all like a champ, but inwardly berated himself for his inability to concentrate his wandering thoughts. And yet they'd wandered. They'd strayed, despite his best efforts, back to Lance again and again and again until he failed to block one of Thorne's many fists and paid the price for his inattention. In the galley, he sat on the prep table and nursed the purpling spot on his cheekbone with ice, scowling down at his bedroll and refusing to look at Lance's. All the while, he cursed his own moral compass for landing him here. Chewed out and injured and embarrassed, all because he tried to be nice. He had no idea why the hell he'd done it, really, but last night, Lance's quiet whimpering had finally grown too much to bear. Whenever his bunkmate had these night episodes, Keith normally lay motionless in his bed as he waited for the tears to pass. He hated feeling so powerless to help, but worlds sat between himself and the other boy, and he had the tiniest of suspicion that, considering Lance seemed to take great care to muffle the crying as much as possible, an attempt to help would be most unwelcome. Normally, when Keith stirred in the middle of the night to the sound of muffled sobs, the rustle of movement a few feet away indicated that his companion was awake and restless. Last night, for the first time, he hadn't been. Keith had woken to the sound of agonized, unrestrained whimpers as Lance tossed and turned atop his roll, clearly in the throes of a nightmare. Refusing to be a bystander any longer, Keith quietly heaved himself to his feet, snatching his blanket before picking his way over to Lance in the darkness. It was only by the dim light of the stairs, peeping through the exit to the galley, that Keith was able to see the way Lance's body shuddered, curling in on itself pathetically as he moaned in his sleep. Without a second thought, Keith drew his blanket, the one he'd brought from Adam's home, warm and thick where Lance's was scratchy and nearly threadbare, over the other boy, careful not to rouse him. Sitting back on his heels, he waited for a couple minutes while Lance calmed, his shaking dying down as he unconsciously clutched at Keith's blanket. He didn't think he'd ever be quite sure what prompted his next wave of madness. It might have been the way Lance whined, his head rotating so that the starlight illuminated glistening cheeks. It might have been the sweat plastering the boy's hair to his forehead. It might have been the way Lance looked so heartbreakingly mournful in his slumber, or the way that Keith's chest clenched with empathy as he watched over him. Before he was even conscious of the movement, he was reaching out with feather-light touch to brush the sweaty hair off of Lance's forehead, the way Keith's own father had always used to do when he had nightmares. For a heart-stopping moment, Lance's breath hitched, and Keith froze, fingers still threading through sticky, wet hair. Self-awareness came careening back into him, and he held his breath, cursing himself as he silently begged Lance not to wake. The boy's breath evened out once more, and Keith released a relieved sigh, gently extracting his fingers from Lance's hairline and retreating to his own bed. He should have known that he'd woken him. It had been so painfully obvious. Stupid idiot. Why hadn't Lance said something? Grabbed his hand and demanded to know what the hell Keith thought he was doing. Why the fuck had he just let him do that? Now Keith stood, too bored icing his cheek and too wired to continue to sit and worry over the previous night's events. Turning, he chucked the remaining ice into the sink before wiping his cold palms against his cargo pants, stomping up onto the deck to complete his morning chores, his irritation at both himself and Lance mounting with each step. He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't notice the huddled crew members until he was nearly on top of them. With little more than a couple yards between them, their conspiratorial whispers invaded his consciousness, and Keith quickly changed course, ducking behind the lookout pole and busying himself with coiling some rope that had been haphazardly thrown to the floor. Struggling to hear more than a vague word here and there, Keith slowly inched around the pole, attempting to look nonchalant as he tiptoed closer. He was almost close enough to make out what Roth, the alien with the face for a stomach, was saying when something wet flicked at the shell of his ear. "Cabin boys should learn to mind their own business," a voice hissed, and Keith couldn't help the surprised gasp that left him, or the way he whirled around so hard that he stumbled backward into Roth's arms. The large alien pinned him in place, with two meaty hands, and Keith struggled in his grip as Marina, the crew member who seemed to despise him the most, slithered down the lookout pole, her long tongue coiling and uncoiling as she descended. Fuck. Why hadn't he checked the post? He thought himself to be so discreet that the snake woman had seen the whole thing from her vantage point up above. Keith was jostled roughly as the group unfurled from their tight circle, revealing Marina's sister, Rave, in the mix. She winked at him, blowing him a kiss with one of her many tentacles, and giggling when he glowered at her. "You should be more careful, little one," Marina cooed, bringing his attention back to her half-serpentine form. She raised a clawed hand and stroked his face, and he wrenched his head to the side in disgust. In retaliation, she grabbed his jaw, her sharp fingers digging into his skin as she turned him to look at her. "Sneaking about brings trouble, no doubt," she sang, baring her teeth in a sharp-toothed grin. "Are you looking for trouble, human?" Finally, giving up his fight against Roth's steel grip, Keith leveled Marina with the most vehement glare he could manage. "Why? Are you?" The smile slipped off her face, her slitted eyes flashing with anger. "You insolent whelp!" "Someone want to explain what's going on?" Every head, including Keith's, still grasped between Marina's fingers, turned towards the sound of Lance's voice. He stood a few feet away, leaning against the banister with his hands tucked into his pockets, the perfect picture of nonchalance. Marina hissed, her sharp fangs glinting as she bared them in display of hostility. "This does not concern you, little blue." A couple of the other crew members chuckled, and Lance held out a hand, like, "All right, you got me." "Fair enough, but it concerns him." The cyborg's voice hardened as he pointed a casual finger at Keith, who, completely perplexed, resisted the urge to pull a face. What the hell is he doing? "And I need him for work, so..." Lance shrugged, slipping his hands back into his pockets as he pushed himself away from the banister, taking a few unfaltering steps toward them. "I suggest you let him go." When no one moved, Lance pursed his lips, rocking onto the balls of his feet as he whistled. "Huh, okay. I can always grab Silver if we want to do this the hard way," and with a guttural growl, Marina released her grip on Keith's face, throwing his head back into Roth's chest. As she reluctantly slithered away, her eyes locked with Keith's like the predator onto its prey, and he shuddered under the undisguised hatred she radiated. "Oh, hey," Lance was saying, his voice high with false nonchalance. "Look at that. Not so hard after all." Roth released him, shooting him with a withering glare as he retreated alongside the other crew members, each going their separate ways as they returned to the day's tasks. When the two of them were finally alone, Lance huffed, the cool mask slipping from his face, and he shot Keith an apologetic grimace. I'd ask what happened, but Ren's kind of known for picking fights for no good reason. His eyes roved over Keith's face, his mouth pulling into a frown. She didn't give you that shiner, did she? Keith could barely do anything more than blink dumbly at the other boy. What the hell was happening? Had he been transported to another dimension? Anyways, Lance continued when Keith didn't respond, clearing his throat awkwardly. You're welcome. Wait, what? What? Lance's eyebrows furrowed. You're welcome? For the save? The what? Impatience leaked into the lines of the other boy's face. You know, he waved a hand. 3 seconds ago, when I saved your ass from getting kicked? And, oh, well, Keith certainly didn't need any favors, so Lance could go fuck himself as far as Keith and the throbbing bruise under his eye were concerned. With a temper that was rising by the second, Keith shoved past the other boy, taking care to knock their shoulders together. Yeah, well, I didn't need saving. I had it covered. You had it covered? Lance echoed incredulously, his voice rising in anger as Keith stepped farther and farther away. Are you seriously going to be a prick instead of just thanking me? The sound of pursuing footsteps followed Keith across the deck, and he sped up, not entirely sure where he was going, but determined to get away. The least you could do was look at me, asshole. I was just trying to help. I don't need your help. Keith whirled back on him, his hands clenched into a tight fist. He might have gone on, but Lance was throwing his arms out to his sides. Okay, well then, neither did I last night. A hot, angry flush raced up the back of Keith's neck. Okay, fine then. Fine. Have fun with your night terrors or whatever. See if I fucking care. Lance sneered. Thanks, that's sweet. And hey, while you're at it, have fun making friends. Keith growled, pivoting on his heels and stomping away as Lance hollered, Since you seem to be so fucking good at it. Stopping at the entrance of the galley, Keith spun around, a hand shooting out to grasp the open hatch. Fuck you. Fuck you. Not once in the 2 long weeks of the rivalry, as Lance liked to call it for whatever stupid reason, had things between them gotten this bad. The two of them spent the rest of the day trapped in silence, charged with fury and resentment. It leaked into their work, as well as into their interactions with the rest of the crew. One particular instance had left Keith feeling awful for snapping at Cheryl, but then he'd heard Lance lose his cool at Roth for stepping over newly mopped floor, and Keith thought that, good, at least he's just as miserable as I am. Meal prep that evening was an even bigger nightmare than usual. They'd managed to mostly stay out of one another's hair during the day, shooting each other the occasional poisonous glare across the deck over the handles of their mops and around the sides of heavy crates. Now they were stuck in the tiny galley with Karan, who was the only crew member that seemed oblivious to the tension between them. He prattled on about everything and anything, missing the way Lance nearly lost a finger trying to cut a yerba root faster than Keith, and the way Keith nearly sloshed boiling water all over himself as he snatched a pot from Lance. Dinner found the two of them locked in a heated stare-down across the mess hall, both refusing to back down even as their silverware clattered noisily against their plates. More than once, Keith spotted Cheryl glancing back and forth between them, opening his mouth as if to say something and closing it promptly when Keith slammed his drinking canteen against the table. Cheryl left him after dinner with a little more than a nervous glance and a tentative wave that Keith returned with a curt nod. Already moving to clear his cousin's plate, as the last of the crew trickled out of the mess hall, the silence around the 2 cabin boys grew almost unbearably stifling. Lance was on wash duty tonight, and even in the confined space, Keith was careful to keep some distance between them as he dried. In the terse silence, Keith could feel their collective anger growing to a boiling point, evidenced by the jerkiness of Lance's movements and the rigidness of his back, and by Keith's own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He wished he could have been anywhere else at that moment. I hate him, Keith realized, nearly breaking a bowl as he angrily set it aside. I hate him. It was an accident. Logically, Keith knew that. But as Lance dropped a pile of plates into the sink with a little more forcefully than he'd likely intended, sending a wave of scummy dishwater and suds soaking down Keith's front, not a single part of Keith's brain cared for logic. For a couple seconds, the two of them stared at one another, stunned in silence. Lance's eyes were wide, both hands raising to cover his mouth. Keith, No. Fuck that. He didn't want to fucking hear it. Powered by pure rage, Keith lunged, grasping a pot submerged in the murky sink water, and appending it over Lance's head before throwing it to the floor with shaking hands. Lance spluttered, wiping grimy liquid out of his eyes, and Keith couldn't help but think that he looked like the personification of a boiling kettle. Are you fucking kidding, dude? It was an accident! Yeah, Keith growled, hardly even able to remember how to speak through the flames roaring through his mind. So was that. Oh, fuck you. With lightning-quick reflexes, Lance dipped his hands into the suds, which were almost gray with filth, and dumped a heapful on top of Keith's head. There, so was that. Keith reached for one of the unwashed bowls, scooping out a handful of goo and smearing it down Lance's face as he growled. Okay, then, so's this. Through gritted teeth. The other boy gasped. His raised hands uncurling and curling into fists as goo dripped from the fringe into his eyes, and Keith couldn't help himself. What? He taunted. That all you got, cabin boy? Lance practically snarled, knocking a palm into the sink and sending another wave of stinking water up into Keith's face. Stars, I fucking hate you. As he staggered back a step or two, Keith's hand landed on an open burlap sack filled with raw grain. The feelings mutual. He grunted, lobbing a handful of fine grain at his companion. Lance swore, raising his hands protectively over his eyes as he attempted to duck out of the way. You're fucking insane. You could have got that in my eyes. Keith dragged an arm across his sopping forehead. Don't be such a fucking baby. Oh, me? Don't be a baby? Lance turned and looked for ammunition, and Keith's stomach sank with dread when the other boy noticed the trash sack to his left. This is the baby who started it. Keith whirled, practically diving for the table to his right, and grabbing one of their food trays just in time to shield himself from the projectile Lance had lobbed at his head. Whatever it was collided heavily against the tray with a thud before rolling to the floor. I did not, Keith protested hotly. I already told you, it was an accident. The word was punctuated with another projectile, and this one bigger than the last, and Keith gritted his teeth as he nearly lost his grip on the tray. You're impossible. You never fucking listen. I'm impossible? Have you met you? Feeling sufficiently over their stupid little game, Keith tossed the tray aside as it clattered to the floor with a clang. On the opposite side of the table, Lance stood frozen with an entire melon rind raised above his head, as if he'd been about to throw it and stopped himself just in time. I mean, what the fuck is your deal? 1 second, we're fine, and then the next, you hate me. Lance's eyes burned into his as he tossed the rind to the floor. Oh, you want to talk about mixed signals? Who the fuck gives someone their blanket and then yells at them when they're trying to be nice? I don't know. Keith's voice cracked with raw emotion. You're so damn confusing. Lance opened his mouth to respond, but Keith prowled on before he could speak. It's like, just when I think we're actually getting somewhere, you get all pissy for no reason, and we're back to square one. I wasn't pissy today. I don't just mean today, Lance. His brittle voice felt rough around the edges. You've hated me since the day we met. Well, maybe if you just fucking apologized, none of this would have happened. Fine, Keith bellowed. I'm fucking sorry. Is that what you wanted to hear? Yes. Keith threw his hands into the air and released a short, maniac laugh, trying to ignore the fact that he felt and sounded slightly insane. Great, there it is then. I'm sorry I bumped into you, and I wish it hadn't happened. Thank you. You're welcome. Both boys stood panting at one another, their chests heaving with exertion, and Keith wasn't sure what to do next. At some point during the last few minutes, he'd subconsciously resigned himself to the idea that they were never going to reach the end, that they'd lived out their lives screaming at one another in this tiny galley. But now that it was all over, well, now what? He swallowed, searching Lance's eyes for some hint, some clue, but Lance looked just as stunned as he felt, as if he were still trying to digest what had just happened. They stared. Silence pressed in on them, seeming to stretch a moment that lasted for seconds into hours. And then Lance laughed. It was small at first, a little chuckle that quickly consumed him, overtaking his body until he was shaking with mirth, grasping his stomach as he bent. Keith watched him with wide eyes, afraid at first that he had broken the boy. Lance flapped a hand, steadying himself against the counter with his other. Sorry, you look fucking ridiculous. Keith felt his eyebrows narrow. Excuse me? You... Lance broke off into another peal of laughter. Your hair, dude, you've got like a bubble mohawk. Frowning, Keith swiped a hand over the top of his head, drawing it away to find a handful of suds. He winced in disgust, wiping it off on his pants as Lance's laughter increased. Fighting to ignore the flush creeping up his neck, Keith folded his arms across his chest. Yeah, well, you don't look so good either, hotshot. Seeming to remember the layer of goo covering his face, Lance grinned, swiping a finger across his cheek and sticking it into his mouth. He hummed thoughtfully as Keith gaped at him in confusion. Yep, just as nasty from my face as it is from the pot. It wasn't that funny. It really wasn't that funny, but Keith's snort turned into a giggle, and before he knew it, both he and Lance were doubled over with hysterical laughter as they pointed at one another, reveling in the ridiculousness of the entire situation. I can't believe you threw a melon rind. I've never had an apology yelled at me like that. That was so fucking funny, dude. They gravitated towards one another as they laughed, sinking tiredly down to sit on the floor, their backs against the sink cabinet, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Their full-blown hysteria eventually died down into sporadic giggles, and Keith relished the sensation of their laughter as their bodies shook against one another. Feeling thoroughly strung out, Keith let his head fall back, Adam's apple exposed, and his eyes slipped shut. The last of his laughter tapered off into a contented sigh, but his smile remained. A shoulder bumped against his, and he turned his head, peeking at Lance from behind his bangs. The other boy was already watching him with a soft smile that made him squirm, and he resisted the urge to look away. Hey, did you mean what you said? Keith blinked, momentarily confused, and then, oh, right. Yeah. He made himself hold Lance's eyes. The blue-green stared back at him, mirroring his sincerity. I really am sorry, Lance. I should have said it sooner. I was a prick. The corner of Lance's mouth lifted, and Keith found himself hesitantly returning the smile. Guess I kind of made it hard to apologize in the moment. A little, Keith admitted, pressing his lips together to fight his begrowing smile. Lance snorted, letting his head fall back onto the cupboard with a thunk, all the while keeping his eyes trained on Keith's. I'm sorry, too. Thanks, and, Keith bit the inside of his cheek, wrestling his pride into submission. Thanks for earlier, too. The surprise on Lance's face melted into something so soft that Keith was forced to look away, rolling his head back to the center. You're welcome. A short silence fell over them, uncomfortable only for the fact that Keith actually wanted to keep talking, terrified that if they stopped, this moment between them might have just been a dream. You think we would have been friends? Keith blinked, turning back to Lance with a curious tilt to his head. What? The other boy's face was bright red, his eyes trained on his knees, and his mouth twisted into a guilty frown. If we hadn't, Oh. He was quiet for so long that Lance began to fidget, picking at a thread on his pants. I think, he said, slowly, watching as Lance's fingers froze at the sound of his voice, that maybe it doesn't matter. Was it him, or did Lance look slightly disappointed? Pressing a hand against the cupboard, Keith heaved himself onto his feet, and Lance's surprised eyes followed him up. I mean, maybe we just start over. He cleared his throat. He, hell below and stars above. This was so cringy. Who even was he? Ashura was here to see this. He steeled himself, holding out a hand to the boy below. Keith Kagane, nice to meet you. For an uncomfortable second, Lance merely blinked up at him, but then his face bloomed into a grin that crinkled his eyes and scrunched his nose, and suddenly the heat burning up the back of Keith's neck was worth it. Grasping Keith's hand, Lance hoisted himself up, giggling as he nearly lost his balance. The name's Lance, he purred, wiggling his eyebrows as he gave Keith's hand a firm shake. Keith snorted as he rolled his eyes, which only seemed to widen Lance's grin. Lance McClain, good to meet you, haircut. Keith scowled, but the expression was difficult to hold when he was feeling this. I literally just gave you my name. Yep, Lance beamed at him, his eyes alight with roguish glee. Haircut Kagane, heard you loud and clear. Despite his most stubborn efforts, a huff of laughter ripped out of him, and Keith tore his hand from Lance's grasp to direct a light punch to his shoulder. This what being friends with you is going to be like? He'd been expecting Lance to return the jab with one of his witty quips. Instead, the boy's face fell once more into that unbearably soft expression, and Keith swore he could feel his heart rate quicken. Yeah. Unable to hold eye contact for much longer, Keith shoved his hands back into his pockets. Better than rivals, I guess. Lance laughed, bright and embarrassed, and Keith felt like someone who'd just struck gold. Right, I'm not sure that we'd survive. I'm not sure that we'd have survived that trip like that, he admitted, sheepishly rubbing the back of his undercut. I don't think the ship would have survived, Keith muttered, turning to survey the disaster zone they'd created. Food and water covered the floor, giving the place a distinct Cosmo teleported 50 times in here kind of aesthetic. Oh, fuck me. We still gotta clean this up, Lance moaned, smacking a palm to his forehead. We suck, Keith. Fuck the rivalry. Another smile rose to Keith's face, and it occurred to him that he just might know the answer to Lance's question. Yeah, he quietly agreed as he watched his new friend reach for the mop with a dramatic groan. Fuck the rivalry. Cleaning took considerably less time than Keith thought it would. He and Lance moved as a unit, tossing dish rags to one another across the room and drying the spots that the other washed. All the while, they prodded and teased and quipped, and Keith marveled at the way the work seemed to fly by. Every time Lance grinned at him from across the table, Keith felt as if he were suddenly full of boundless energy that thrummed through his body and made him feel unstoppable. A couple hours had passed by the time they'd both exited the washroom, freshly bathed and free of muck. They grinned sheepishly at one another as they stole, towel-clad and quietly snickering, across the dark deck. Their footsteps light across the smooth wood. The cool winds of the Ethereum whipped at Keith's hair and cheeks, making him shiver with a thrill of vitality. Before long, they'd laid out their bedding on the newly washed floor, and climbed in, stretching out their aching bodies, and as their relief sighs punctuated the silence. For the first time in the couple weeks they'd known one another, the silence wasn't smothering, but filled with warmth, and Keith basked in its ambuscile glow. Cozy and content, his eyes were just starting to slide closed when Lance's voice cut through the darkness, quiet and intimate. Hey, Keith? Lacking the energy to speak, Keith hummed in acknowledgement. All was still, and he was beginning to slip under, wondering distantly if he'd merely imagined the other boy's voice, when after a hesitant pause it came. We make a pretty good team. The warmth surging between them seeped into Keith's cheeks, and he turned his smile into the pillow, submitting easily to slumber.